Hello, I'm Rahul Bhardwaj, the President and CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors. Thank you for joining the latest in our series of ICD webcasts exploring the various dynamics of the COVID-19 health and financial crisis that boards of directors, business and societal leaders will need to grasp so they can better map their go-forward strategy and the road ahead. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by David Frum to discuss the geopolitical implications of COVID-19 and what we're likely to see play out in the Canada-US context over the coming months, and the global knock-on effects that will affect strategic planning for directors in the coming months and years. David is a senior editor at The Atlantic, and as a Canadian American with deep ties in Washington, he's also better positioned than almost anyone to provide political analysis of our special but increasingly trying relationship with the US. David has previously served as chairman of the board of trustees of Policy Exchange, the leading center-right think tank in the UK, as a speechwriter and special assistant to President George W. Bush, and as a senior advisor to the Rudy Giuliani presidential campaigns. He's the author of 9 books, including the forthcoming Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy, which will be released next month by HarperCollins. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much.
David, I'd like to start by getting your view on what COVID-19 situation is doing to the state of Canada's most important international relationship with the United States. And in particular, we note that tensions arose in the Trump administration's attempt to prevent the export to Canada of personal protective equipment, as well as U.S. proposal to post troops at our border.
Right.
How should Canada navigate and try to alleviate some of these tensions?
This is such an important turning point in the U.S.-Canada relationship, in the global network of trade and investment. And I think many of the people who are watching this webinar are in a real position to influence the choices that people make over in the next little while, for good or for ill. The COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic has confronted us all with some of the costs of dependence on China as a source of supply of medical equipment and medical supplies, and many pharmaceutical drugs, many important drugs. And I think we need to take that seriously. The danger is the choices governments are making as to how to respond. And one choice is the one that was indicated in an exasperated moment by Ontario Premier Ford, which is that each and every country must become more self-sufficient in this crucial aspect of the economy. Not only the United States, but Canada and others too. And that invites us to a world in which we are returning to the old days of national champions, nationally favored industries, and high barriers to trade, maybe only in medicine. But when you think healthcare is, in most countries, something around 15% of GDP, in the United States even higher. And as the populations age throughout the developed world, on the way to more and more. You start putting a sixth or a fifth of your economy off limits and saying that we must be self-sufficient, at least in the physical materials. You are moving away from a world of integration. There are other choices, and your voices are going to be very important in choosing other possibilities. And let me put 2 ideas on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And if people take nothing else away from this talk, this is what I would like them to take away. The fact that China is a problem as a source of supply doesn't mean that everybody else must therefore become each person's own independent source of supply. The United States supplies in the United States, Canada, Britain, Japan, and what? Slovenia supplies Slovenia. We can return to a world of freer trade, China minus. That is, accept that China is a problem, but then integrate everybody else. And when you say, well, how can we be safe in a world in which the Americans have shown themselves so unreliable? And maybe there'll be a better president someday or a more conscientious president. But once you know they've done it, maybe they'll do it again. Maybe, as Premier Ford said, does that mean you need as an emergency? I think the answer to that, and this is the other idea I'd like you to take away, is you do not need to make your own equipment so long as you have stockpiled enough of it. That national stockpiling is way more economical than national production. And now stockpiling requires some difficulty in management because you can't just buy the stuff and forget about it. You have to maintain the stockpile. But I think people are worried about self-sufficiency. They need to focus on that. Stockpiling, not production.
Interesting. So let's come back and focus on the U.S. for just a minute, David. So in any normal year, the U.S. election would dominate the news cycle. But now there's some discussion on whether there will even be a vote in November. The Democrats now have their nominee. So what do you think will be the likely impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the general election in the U.S.?
Well, from a strictly technical point of view, there are limits to what can be done to tamper with the American election. Remember, the U.S. Constitution gives the date on which the new president takes office. So there has to be an inauguration date in January. That's constitutional. You can't change that. The election is to a great extent a product of state law. So while individual states have decisions to make, the idea that somebody at the center of the system would give some order that would somehow interfere with the election, it doesn't work that way. The states operate the election system. That said, as we just saw in Wisconsin, states have a lot of opportunity to make choices, and in some cases, to make mischief. States can allow mail-in ballots or not, and some of the Republican states are looking to limit mail-in balloting as a way to suppress the Democratic vote. All of that said, even if we have the best possible success against this terrible plague, even if we find treatments by early summer, the economies begin to come out of lockdown, people begin to return to work in July and August. Given that unemployment in the United States is right now what? I mean, it's increasing faster than the economists can count. It's probably right now at 15%. So that's maybe on the way north of 15, maybe toward 20. We're talking about, a couple of dozen million people out of work. How fast, even under the best circumstances, can you call those people back? The United States will be facing very high levels of joblessness in the fall. I don't see any way around that. And that's real trouble for any incumbent.
Any prediction, David?
Well, my prediction is Trump was in a lot of trouble before this, and he's in much more trouble now. And a lot of the increasingly erratic behavior you see from him has been...
Sure, I can see that as well. So let's just shift the lens to North America. So David, let's just move this, shift the lens a little bit back to beyond North America now for a moment. So prior to the epidemic, there were signs of a decline in the multilateralism that you were speaking about a little bit earlier. And just yesterday, we saw President Trump announce that he was withholding funding for the World Health Organization, even though it's unclear he can actually even do that. The question is, do you think the pandemic will continue to erode multilateral institutions, or as many would hope, do we come to better appreciate the importance of international cooperation and then rebuild global institutions?
Well, Adam Posen, who was the head of the Peterson Center for International Economics, and before that a governor of the Bank of England, often says, globalization is as unstable as uranium. It is you're either improving it or it is degrading. You're either working toward better integration or you're watching integration deteriorate. And so we have for some time been watching cooperation deteriorate. What has happened in this pandemic reminds us of how important this is. I mean, President Trump's actions against WHO are just grandstanding. But think about it. In a world without an equivalent of the World Health Organization, how will we know about a pandemic that originates in China? The answer will be we'll have to rely on China for information. If you don't trust China, and we shouldn't, that means you need to work toward a world in which there is more international cooperation, more effective supervision of things like pandemics. The 2014 Ebola virus is a case study in how effectively global institutions can limit something that threatened to rip out of control. And although people suffered terribly in the part of Africa where the 2014 non-pandemic epidemic struck, that it was successfully contained and then eradicated before it's expanded out of the area. One of the things that made the world so vulnerable to this was Donald Trump inherited a staff of 47 Americans embedded into different places in the Chinese healthcare bureaucracy. China has the equivalent of the Centers for Disease Control. Some of them were there. China has a Department of Agriculture. There was an American stationed there. Other places in the bureaucracy too. So you had eyes and ears inside China. President Trump, in over 2 years, reduced by 2/3 the number of Americans operating independently inside China to keep an eye on things. That meant he was more dependent on what the Chinese said. That's what nationalism does, is it makes you weaker. We are going to need stronger international institutions. I mean, what we also need to contemplate is, what if this disease had originated not in China, but in a smaller, poorer, weaker state, like Cambodia? Not to single out Cambodia, but just as an example. They would need international support desperately and urgently in order to contain a virus. And the thing we've learned here is you can't start from scratch. That support has to be ready to go. If it's deployable, as it was in 2014, you can move fast. If you have to build it first, then you move slow.
Right. So let's come back to the respond quickly part. So a lot of commentary during the global crisis is focused on some countries' ability to respond quickly and comprehensively to the pandemic. But media coverage suggests that more autocratic states, such as China, seem better equipped than their more democratic counterparts to respond to disease outbreaks. Do you think that democracies struggle to formulate effective responses to issues such as pandemics?
I think that is precisely backwards. I think the real lesson of this has been an autocratic regime like China was slow because its own leaders did not know what was happening, because lying is built into the system. I encourage, if you have not watched the 5-part Chernobyl drama, I encourage everyone to go back and watch that, because what you see is how lying is engineered into an authoritarian system. It cannot cope with bad news. Meanwhile, in our democratic systems, in some cases, governments responded well. In some cases, the governments responded badly, many in between. But because we have free media, just think about your own personal decisions. Did you wait for an order from anybody to begin to take precautions? Or did you survey the media that was available to and make your own decisions, probably faster than any order came? And there is some early research on this, that what predicts the speed at which community acted was the intensity of its online penetration of online Wi-Fi. If you know the truth, you can make good decisions. And we don't need 100% of the people in our community to make it. A virus is interrupted if just a sufficient number of people begin to block it. This thing has to hop from person to person in order to live. If we can interrupt that hopping, and you don't need everyone to do it, just the best informed. So I think that this story is going to be one of the triumph of civil society, the importance of free media, people making their own decisions in the face of uncertainty.
So let's build on that theme just a little bit more, because we've seen that some autocrats are using COVID-19 as an excuse to expand their powers in places such as Brazil, Hungary, the Philippines, and other societies like South Korea and Singapore. We've seen leaders use their extraordinary power to surveil their citizens' compliance with COVID-19 restrictions. Yeah. So I'd be curious, do you have any thoughts around the implications this might have for privacy and for the democratic rights after the pandemic?
Well, there are important, this is a very hard question. So South Korea is a very free society. People have visited there, know they have free elections, freedom of speech, lots of individual rights. They do not have a strong privacy culture in the way that North America does. And that's partly a legacy of the years of dictatorship. That's partly because they're a frontline state against a highly aggressive neighbor. There may be other reasons too. And so South Koreans are untroubled by the idea that the devices in their life are monitoring them. And if they have a fever, that the device tells the authorities, and the authorities come, and they're not hostile authorities, they're compassionate, they take care of you, but they quarantine you. They also send you, it's a society with a high level of social provision. I have some friends there, and they showed me, if you are involuntarily quarantined, you get a daily basket from the government, and they open up the basket. And there are a lot of Canadian families that would be very happy to see that basket arrive. It's got fresh fruit, it's got fresh vegetables, it's got ample supplies. It is a wealthy and generous society. But you might not like to live in a world in which your phone keeps track of you, whether you like it or not. So we're going to have to find ways to engineer privacy guarantees into our systems. But the age of pandemics is here. It is the price of globalization. In the past, human beings lived in local disease pools. But because it was hard for most diseases to get over the mountains into the next disease pool. We remember events like the Black Death precisely because it was so rare for something to become universal until the 20th century. And the influenza epidemic of 1918 was an example, but that was dependent on the special circumstances of the First World War. But we are now going to live in a world in which if somebody gets sick in South Korea, people are going to get sick in South America because of the intensity of our contacts. So we need to build this planning into our lives as just a normal part of our self-protection. And we are going to have to find ways to do that while respecting ideas of privacy that vary enormously from society to society, place to place.
And David, just to close off that, you're describing a new normal in many ways, whether it's around pandemic, globalization, privacy. Do you have any counsel that you'd be providing to directors and Canadian corporations on how they might start to think about changing their approach to the old normal versus the new normal?
Well, my first suggestion is do not think of this exposure to pandemics as a sign that your society is failing. Think of it as the world we want is a world in which human beings enjoy high and rising standards of living, that prosperity is ever more broadly shared, we're ever more integrated, and we live ever more profoundly at peace. Pandemics are in many ways a price of the kind of world peace that we have had more and more of since World War II and especially since 1990. That a world open to trade and commerce is going to be a world open to microbes. Pandemics, as they used to say about heart attacks when people began eating more meat, this is a disease, this is a problem of prosperity. So don't lament it, prepare for it. And what we also have seen is, that we are more resilient to this thing than we were in 1918 because people are healthier, better fed, better educated. So the investments that we have made in improving our society, they are really paying off. That infrastructure, which 60% of people in the United States, I don't know the figure in Canada, have annual flu shots. It should be 100. But that turned out, although they're not exactly the same thing, there is some evidence that just having the flu shot created a baseline of immunity that made you more resistant to coronavirus, even though it was a different kind of disease than a flu. I think we should welcome investments in science and technology, and we should also, I think we also need to think about how we reallocate defense budgets. And this is more for Americans than Canadians. President Trump is now spending about $100 billion more a year on national defense than President Obama did in his last year, even though Obama was fighting a hot war in Afghanistan and the pace of combat operations is slower under Donald Trump. We are at real risk of making our national security investments in the problems and technologies of half a century ago. Tanks, rockets, aircraft carriers. We should think of defense budgets as our insurance policy, our insurance against all negative contingencies. And we all together in the developed world, we spend a lot of money on those insurance policies. Let's make sure that they are apportioned rationally, and that we are not saying for a naval war with China, which is exceedingly unlikely to happen, and we're spending 10% on everything else. That this pandemic should remind us, you know what, there are a lot of threats. Naval war with China is maybe not one of the most likely, and we should be investing. To protect ourselves against the spectrum of these things, and that's what government at its best does. Is it is a giant system for sifting, focusing the attention of decision makers on the range of things that can go wrong, not just one or two.
Great. Well, thank you for your insights today, David. I think you've really got us to think about, not to lament, but to think about risk differently and the new normal. So I really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you all for watching. Please look out for new installments of this series as we navigate this challenge together. Bye for now.